Hey everybody, this week's topic is virtue ethics, which is chapter 12. So hopefully I had a chance to read that. I had mentioned last time that ethics of care is sometimes looked at as a type of virtue ethics, and the two are different, but you'll be able to see why some people think of it that way. Now, even though this is the last real ethical theory that we're going to look at, after this we're going to switch gears a little bit. This is actually the oldest theory in the book so far, with the exception of the divine command theory, which predates virtue ethics by just a tiny little bit of time. And this comes to us from Aristotle, who is an ancient Greek philosopher and a student of Plato, who is where the divine command theory is from, which is why it predates it just a little bit. And Aristotle went on to actually become the private tutor of Alexander the Great, and also to completely dominate Western thinking for about 1600 years, to the point where the Roman Catholic Church, when the Roman Empire happened, adopted Aristotle, and it was just as blasphemous to say something that Aristotle didn't agree with as it was to say something that went against Christianity and the church. So, for virtue ethics, the starting point here is going to be different from the other ones. In utilitarianism and the social contract theory and Kant and relativism and all these other theories, they take the starting point of, what am I supposed to do in any given circumstance? So when I find myself in an ethical dilemma, how do I figure out what I'm supposed to do in that circumstance? But virtue ethics says, instead of looking at actions and a prescription for actions, let's look at the type of person that you are. It focuses on the character. And the idea is, if you foster your character and become a virtuous person, then when you are in ethical dilemmas, you're going to know what to do. So the difference is, take, I don't know, music as an analogy. So you could teach somebody how to play a couple of very specific songs on a guitar, so that they would know how to play that one specific song if somebody ever wanted to hear it. Excuse me. Or you could actually teach them how to play guitar. You could teach them the different chords, the different notes, the strings, the transitions, all that kind of stuff. And then they'd be able to play a much broader catalog of music than just those few specific songs that maybe you had taught them before. Sorry. So we can look at ethics in kind of the same way. So instead of just giving you the tools for a few specific circumstances, like the other theories maybe do, we are teaching you how to be an ethical person, so that you have a whole lot more options to figure out what to do if you are in an ethical dilemma. So what is a virtue? Your book defines this on page 159. Aristotle said a virtue is a trait of character manifested in habitual action. And the habitual part means that it's a habit, which is an important part, because everybody can maybe be nice or patient at some point. But if it's not a habit, then it's not really part of their character. So we want the things that are habits, the things that we do all the time, to be virtuous. Now, there are a whole lot of different virtues, right? And the alternative here are vices. Those are like the bad things that we don't want. Now, you have a partial list here of the virtues on page 160. Benevolence, compassion, fairness, honesty, self-discipline, loyalty, on and on and on. Aristotle gave us even more than that. Now, not all of these virtues are going to be things that everybody needs to have. So certainly a parent is going to need a lot of virtues that somebody that's childless is not going to need to have, because there are certain virtues in dealing with the way we talk to children or interact with them or teach them that somebody that's not really around children is not going to need to worry about. Same thing if you're in a monogamous relationship versus being single. There are certain virtues that apply to a romantic relationship that don't apply if you're single, and you don't have to worry about those things, like maybe being faithful or something like that. So the type of virtues that Aristotle was concerned with are the ones that it would be good for everybody to have, regardless of what their profession was, what their home life was, what culture they were from, what time period. So there might be some things that are not going to be universal, but the ones that he was most concerned with are the ones that will apply across the board and will be beneficial for everybody to have. And we get a little bit more of a detailed discussion here about a few specific ones: courage, generosity, honesty, and loyalty to friends and family. There are a lot of other ones, they just picked 4. And for Aristotle, the big thing with virtue is that it is a middle path between 2 extremes. It's a life of moderation. And this is an idea that was very common in the ancient world, both Eastern with people like Confucius, and Taoism, as well as Western with people like Socrates and now Aristotle. So the idea is, take courage, for example. Now, it's a bad thing to be a coward and to never stand up for yourself, to never do anything that might present some sort of adventure because you're just terrified of it. But it's also a bad thing to be foolhardy and to be courageous for no good reason. So, like, you run by a building that's on fire and you think, oh, I'm going to run in just in case there's a cat in there somewhere, right? I mean, that's not courageous. That's just kind of stupid at that point if you are putting yourself in a very dangerous situation and you don't really have a good reason to do it. You just kind of go. So the idea is courage. That is the mean between the extremes. Same thing with everything else. Generosity. You don't want to get to the point where you're so generous that, number 1, people take advantage of you. Or number 2, you give away everything you have and all your time, and now you're even worse off than the people you're trying to help. But you also don't want to be a cheapskate who never helps anybody or sacrifices their time or whatever for others. So generosity, knowing when to give, when to be helpful, and when to say no, or when to acknowledge that you don't have the ability to say yes. So for the virtue ethicist, the idea is to develop a virtuous character. And if we have a prescription here, which your book doesn't really give us, that we can apply to different circumstances, so sort of like a procedure that we got with the other theories, it would be something like this. An act is morally right if it's what a virtuous person would do, provided that they're acting in character. So it's important to have that little addendum in there because virtuous people make mistakes too. So they might lose their patience at some point. They might, I don't know, be mean or angry or impatient at some point. So the idea is acting in their character, how a virtuous person would normally act. That's what we should look for and emulate. So, it spends a lot of time talking about why these virtues are important. Courage is good because we need to be able to deal with dangerous situations and know what to do. Generosity is good. There's always going to be people who need help and will benefit from our help, and we would always want people to help us if we were the ones in need. So being a virtuous person means you're going to do better in life. So we don't really need Aristotle to tell us that. If you're courageous, generous, honest, and loyal, you're going to have a lot more of a rewarding life, or you'll certainly at least have more rewarding friendships. And remember that we're avoiding both extremes. So this isn't asking for you to give so much that you're going to be taken advantage of by other people. So somebody that emulates these virtues is probably going to be a lot more successful in their personal and everyday interactions with other people. They're going to have a better skill set to be able to succeed in the world. And then there's a lot of other virtues that maybe are important and necessary that do depend kind of on your circumstances. So some of the good things about virtue ethics, your book points out, it gives us the right motivation. So you have this example here of what if you're in the hospital, you've just had a surgery or something, and one of your friends comes to visit you. And you say, I just want you to know how much it means to me that you came to visit me. And your friend says, oh, well, I don't really want to be here. I don't really care. I just felt like I had this obligation to come because you came to visit me when I was in the hospital. Right? That would probably make any sort of like warm, fuzzy feelings you had about them visiting completely go away. And yet there's nothing wrong with what they did. They came to visit you, but it was the motivation. They did it from a sense of duty and obligation. And if you remember, that's what Kant told us to do. But here we're going to see this idea that doesn't make me feel good. Imagine a parent who says to their kid, like, oh, I'm only going to feed you and clothe you because it's an obligation. I don't really care. That'd be terrible. So the idea is that we want the motivation to be from a virtuous place. We want it to be because I love and care about you and I'm a loyal friend. Right? That's a way better motivation. And that's what virtue ethics tells us to have. Another good thing, and this is something we saw last week with ethics of care, is this idea about being able to be partial. So remember that pretty much every theory that we had talked about up until last week, with the exception of maybe subjectivism and some of the earlier ones, told us we had to be impartial, meaning everybody gets a vote, every vote counts equally, we don't get to give special consideration to the people that we care about. Now, last week with ethics of care, our motivation started, our morals started with the people close to us. And here we're not going to get the exact same thing, but what we are going to get is the ability to give special preferential treatment in certain circumstances. And the reason why is because some of the virtues that we should be trying to develop are partial to the people that we care about, like loyalty, for instance, being loyal and faithful. Those are things that apply to people that we already have a personal relationship with. You're not loyal to a stranger that you don't even know. You're loyal and faithful to the people around you that you care about. So there are going to be other virtues like being benevolent and helpful that are going to apply to everyone, regardless of whether or not we know them. But there are going to be specific virtues that just deal with our personal relationships. And when that's the case, then we should be partial in those circumstances. Now, some of the bad things here. You might say, well, what if I don't know anybody that I would consider virtuous? What if I don't have any good virtuous role models? How am I supposed to know what a virtuous person would do in any given circumstance? Not only that, but think about this contextually. So obviously somebody who grows up in Nazi Germany, since that's been a standard example throughout the term, is going to maybe find somebody like Hitler to be an extremely virtuous person. And if that's their moral role model for virtue, then we're probably going to disagree with a whole lot of their moral decisions, even if they think it's virtuous. Alternatively, what makes it seem to be the case that all virtuous people wouldn't necessarily do the same thing? So if we got all the people that maybe we would consider virtuous, even if we could get some sort of consensus on that, and that's debatable, and we ask them what they would do in a specific circumstance, they might not all agree. So imagine, I don't know, maybe a religious figure in your life, a very wise family member, a really, really good friend who always seems to make the right decisions. They probably wouldn't all give you the same piece of advice under the same circumstances. And yet, if we think they're all virtuous, how do we know who to follow? A further problem here is if we say that something is right because it's what a virtuous person would do if they're acting in character, then we really have the same structural problem that the divine command theory had back in the day. So remember, it's not wrong just because God says so. God said it's wrong because it actually is. We have the same sort of a thing here. It's not right just because a virtuous person would do it. The reason a virtuous person does it is because it's actually right. So, again, it's not do this simply because a virtuous person would. Well, there's reasons why a virtuous person acting in character would do that action, and that's because it's the right thing to do. So that makes it maybe a little bit tricky and gives us a structural problem as well. But a lot of people use virtue ethics as a supplement, and I had mentioned this last time with ethics of care. As a supplement to other theories. And they might say something like, I really want the focal point to be on the type of person that I am and not the random actions that maybe I decide to do. But there might be circumstances when I am faced with an ethical dilemma and I'm not sure exactly what to do. And in that sort of case, having an actual procedure like the principle of utility or the categorical imperative or something like that might be helpful for me to figure out on a case-by-case basis when that arises. So it's up to you whether or not you like this idea of the focus being on the type of person that you are and maybe being a little bit vague about certain circumstances, or whether you like a very definitive prescription to apply to any given circumstance that really doesn't have a whole lot to say about your character and the type of person you are in general. So you could be a complete jerk, but if you happen to make the right choices when they arise, then you could still maybe technically be considered a morally good person to these other theories and probably not here for virtue ethics. So things are going to change a little bit coming up here, and we'll talk about that soon.